We hope that you'll participate actively in the discussions today, both in the sessions and also on social media. And for those who are so inclined, our Twitter information is included in the conference materials. As always, we rely on you to make this conference possible, including our very supportive and loyal presenting sponsors, Chevron and Freeport-McMoRan, and our sponsors, Citi, Procter & Gamble, Sempra, and Shell. And our media partner is the Financial Times. Would you please join me in thanking them for their generosity? And you've heard it said so many times, but it's really true. Without their support, we can't do this. So we really do appreciate it. Thank you. We're looking forward to the program today and really pleased that all of you are able to be with us. One quick program note. Secretary of State Tillerson is not going to be able to join us, so his position on the program will be filled by the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Francisco Palmieri. Before I ask Susan Siegel to the podium and before we begin our meal, we also want to take a moment to honor our founder and true friend, David Rockefeller, who passed away on March 20th, 2017, having lived to be over 101 years old. Some of you were with us at his funeral in New York on May 2nd, which provided a compelling retrospective. He was in some ways larger than life, and he will be missed. And as this is our first conference on the Americas since his passing, I'd like to ask each of you to join me, please, in a moment of silence in his honor. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, to begin our program today for the 47th Annual Washington Conference on the Americas, may I introduce to you, or reintroduce to you, the President of the Council of the Americas, Susan Siegel.
Thank you, Eric. I'm pleased to be back in the State Department for our 47th Annual Washington Conference on the Americas. This conference continues to be the most outstanding forum in Washington for business, government, and policy leaders to engage in a substantive analysis of the issues affecting the Western Hemisphere. The conference this year carries a particular importance given the historic changes occurring in Washington today and, frankly, in many countries throughout the hemisphere. The program today will explore in detail their many implications and hopefully provide us a roadmap as we look at the rest of the year. I'd like to thank Eric and his entire team for organizing today's event. You have done an outstanding job, as always. Thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause. I don't really need to stand up and talk about the Council of the Americas. Many of you have heard me talk about the organization and our many activities too many times, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to ask you and thank you for following us throughout the hemisphere and our offices in New York, Washington, Miami, and throughout the many countries that we visit. Our next really big stop and program will be in Mexico City on May 23rd. We hope you will participate. And I also ask all of you, if you haven't read America's Quarterly, our policy journal, to please pick it up and read it. This edition is particularly important and relevant to the conference today and to the issues facing the hemisphere because it focuses on Mexico and the northern border and has a number of really important facts, figures, statistics, and frankly, very meaty articles. So I want to thank you for participating. We're going to begin our program today following the entree with a conversation with Marco Rubio, the U.S. Senator from the state of Florida, who will be introduced by our chairman, Andres Gluski. I also want to take a moment to introduce our host today for our conference, the Acting Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, Francisco Paco Palmieri. If I say Francisco, no one will know who you mean, right? Paco Palmieri. As always, we are pleased and honored to be at the State Department, and we very much appreciate all the work that Paco and the team have done to facilitate this program. And frankly, I also want to just comment that I want to thank the many embassies throughout the hemisphere for all the work that they do and all the support and partnership that they provide to the Council of the Americas throughout the year. So with that, please join me for welcoming Paco Palmieri to the stage.
Good afternoon. On behalf of Secretary Tillerson, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the Department of State. On behalf of the Department and the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, we are very pleased to be co-hosting today's 47th Washington Conference on the Americas with the Council. The Council is one of our most valued partners. It serves as a strong advocate for its member companies and has convened timely dialogues in New York, Washington, and Miami with senior department officials. The Council also routinely brings together private sector leaders and senior government officials in cities across the Americas to discuss opportunities and challenges. We wish you all well on your meetings later this month in Mexico City and Sao Paulo. Among the Council's many initiatives, the Washington Conference is among the premier annual events on the Inter-American calendar. The Washington Conference was also a favorite of your founder, David Rockefeller, who for many years graced the Loy Henderson Conference Room for this event. Mr. Rockefeller's dedication to the Council and the Washington Conference was reflected not only in his participation, but also in his efforts behind the scenes to ensure the conference's success. I want to thank the Council for its leadership and partnership, and I look forward to another successful Washington Conference today. Welcome to the State Department.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your lunch. We will be back to you momentarily. Thank you. Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, may I call us back to order? It is my distinct privilege and pleasure to welcome to the Council of the Americas 47th Annual Washington Conference on the Americas, Senator Rubio, accompanied by the Chairman of the Council, Andres Gluski.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Honored guests who've come from all around the hemisphere to be with us today, and welcome to our Washington Conference. On behalf of the Council of the Americas, I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Marco Rubio, and welcome the members of his team. During his time in the Senate since 2011, Senator Rubio has been a strong advocate for shared prosperity and economic growth throughout the hemisphere. As a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he plays an instrumental role in developing and influencing U.S. foreign policy across the world, while remaining particularly vested in growth and developments in the Western Hemisphere. As chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, Transnational Crime, Civilian Security, Democracy, Human Rights, and Global Women's Issues, Senator Rubio works to advance a common agenda and shared values that the United States has with the region. He has been a leading voice on human rights and democratic principles in the hemisphere, in Cuba and in Venezuela, And as a Venezuelan American married to a Cuban American, it's something that I particularly appreciate. Senator Rubio's values are rooted in his family's achievements, from humble origins, from his parents' arrival to this country in 1956, to earning their way into the middle class. Then this was consolidated by Senator Rubio's then considered unlikely Senate victory against a much favored primary opponent. These experiences have shaped a courageous leadership and steadfast determination to tackle deep-rooted challenges, and leading really to his bursting on the national political scene as a presidential candidate in 2016. Mr. Senator, we thank you for your leadership on issues of such great consequences for the United States' relations in the Western Hemisphere and your friendship with the Council of Americas. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Senator.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So about a month ago, I had to buy these at Walgreens. Something happened overnight. My eyesight started to deteriorate. Is that normal after you turn 45? All right, just want to make sure. But anyway, I'm really honored to be with you here today. It's begin by thanking the Council of the Americas for inviting me to speak. And it's actually a great honor to be here with you in this Benjamin Franklin room, which is a hallowed place. It's named after one of our founding fathers. It's also named after the father of international diplomacy in the United States. So in particular, I want to begin by thanking Andres Gluski, who's chairman of the Council, the Americas Society, and Susan, the president and CEO of the Americas Society, and of course Eric Farnsworth, who will actually be before our subcommittee tomorrow. So hope you get a good night's sleep. We're going to grill you hard. Anyway, it's an honor to be a part of this conference. I think this is actually an exciting time with regard to the United States and the Western Hemisphere, because it gives us an opportunity to rethink policy in many ways outside of normal convention. Let me begin by saying I think there's been, certainly since the end of the Cold War, a lack of focus at some of the highest levels of our government in the hemisphere. And that's something that needs to be reversed quickly, because in the end, our future, both economic and security, is deeply tied to our region. And I say our region because we're a member of this region. Oftentimes when we talk about the Western Hemisphere, we talk about something that's happening somewhere else. We are a part of that. Certainly, if you live where I do in South Florida, you know full well you are a part of it, both economically, culturally, socially, and politically. And so it's an opportunity to be with you here today. What I wanted to take is an opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts gathered over 5 years, 6 years in the Senate, really spending a lot of time. And let me just begin by saying I'm troubled that oftentimes U.S. foreign policy in general and U.S. foreign policy towards the Western Hemisphere in specific is tactically driven versus strategically driven. This is especially true throughout the world, by the way, but we spend a lot of time discussing tactics, sanctions or no sanctions, military action or no military action, diplomatic engagement or no military. Those are tactics, but if they're not in furtherance of a strategy, you're wasting a lot of time. And so I do not pretend to have the, all-knowing strategy on how to pursue the Western Hemisphere, but I do know that we have ideas that we intend to share with the new administration, with the people who work in this building, and with my colleagues in the United States Senate, and with each of you here today. And so while these are not necessarily universally accepted concepts of a strategy, I think they lay the groundwork for a way forward that I don't believe is either partisan, nor in many cases should be controversial. Let's begin by constructing the three pillars of what I hope our engagement in the region will be built on. The first is obviously our safety, security, our national security. The second is expanding economic prosperity. And the third is defending our values. All three are equally important. They are not ordered in any particular way, and they are all interrelated. It is actually impossible to do any of the three without the other two. So let's begin first to talk about how do we keep America safe in the Western Hemisphere. In my view, it begins by countering illicit flows. As many of you are painfully aware, Central America has the highest homicide rates in the world, and citizens of the region have been fleeing in droves, often here to our country. Cubans fleeing the island also added pressure to transit countries in Central America and Mexico, as well as the U.S. border. And these migrant flows, as well as by focusing our assistance on the region on developing institutions key to security, including the court system, public prosecutor offices, police forces, with a special emphasis on Mexico, building on successful aspects of the Mérida Initiative, by helping countries in the region tackle corruption by strengthening their anti-money laundering and asset forfeiture laws and enforcement capabilities, by supporting anti-corruption initiatives like the MACHI in Honduras, and the CICIG, which I'm not sure has an acronym. Is it CICIG? All right, sounds good to me. And by holding countries that are not cooperative, like Bolivia, that are not living up to their international drug control obligations, accountable, and making clear that U.S. assistance could be affected if they do not produce and implement a counter-narcotics plan. By working with Colombia and Peru to resume aerial eradication of coca plants to reduce cocaine production and trafficking, by working with Colombia and Mexico to aggressively eradicate poppy crops in the hemisphere to reduce the heroin entering the United States, by fully utilizing all legal tools that target narco traffickers and their assets, including the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. Security also of outside actors. We are focused on global crisis throughout the world. Many external actors have, in the process, attempted to gain a foothold in our own hemisphere. International terrorist groups who have exploited criminal networks for purposes of raising money could also use these networks one day to access U.S. territory. The region, sadly, has not been immune to the rise of ISIS and other militant groups, as our friends in Trinidad will talk to you about. Meanwhile, U.S. adversaries and sometimes foes, including China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, have sought to exploit anti-American sentiments of some in the region. To counter these disturbing trends, there are a number of things that we should do. First, we should make adequately clear that the United States does not expect other countries in the region to trade solely with us, but that we will not allow our enemies of security, prosperity, democracy, and human rights, to establish a foothold in the region. To speak out and to support pro-American leaders, pro-democracy leaders, responsible leaders who seek to deepen cooperation with the United States, and to make clear that America is not going to leave a vacuum in the region for others to fill. By utilizing bilateral free trade agreements or other trade agreements to increase U.S. economic engagement in the region, including by leveraging the economic power of our allies in Asia, and where possible, by assisting U.S. companies to bid for sales, military sales in the region. Increasing U.S. supporting increase our reporting on and monitoring of the activities of non-state actors in the region, by deepening intelligence cooperation and military relationships with key Latin American partners, and assist those, such as Argentina, for example, that take countering outside influence seriously, by working to build the capacity of smaller states, as I mentioned, like Trinidad and Tobago, that face challenges in this area, and by prioritizing our engagement in multilateral organizations such as the Organization of American States, while at the same time standing up to organizations that deliberately exclude the United States. That's the first pillar of our security. But that alone will not be enough. In fact, that alone will not be possible until we do the other two things. The second would be expanding our economic prosperity and that of our neighbors, because it is not a zero-sum game. Greater economic opportunity for our neighbors not only makes it less likely that migrants would come to the United States in a way that's illegal or irregular, but it actually helps build these economies that become consumer and trade partners with us. In the absence of the TPP, we need robust trade and economic agenda for the hemisphere that makes clear to our partners that China and other actors are not the only, should not be an alternative to the U.S. market. And so this talks about things like forging closer economic ties with countries, including through FTAs that prioritize free market reforms and tackle corruption, and help our partners who enact free market policies connect and deepen their economic relationship with U.S. allies in Asia and other regions. By modernizing NAFTA, but ensuring that the process of doing so does not send the message that the United States is closed for business. Prioritizing strengthening of intellectual property protections, stricter labor standards, the elimination of non-tariff barriers, such as inconsistent custom procedures. But make clear that NAFTA modernization is not hostile to Mexico or Canada, but in fact is designed to be beneficial to all three of us. Accelerate the growth of a robust regional private sector through what I call through a presidential level initiative called the America's Economic Freedom Initiative, to show partners in the region that there is not a need to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This would not be based on foreign assistance, but would find ways to incentivize capital markets and other measures to develop a regional community independent in the production and distribution of a range of products and services, interdependent, in the production and distribution of a range of products and services, particularly energy, allowing smaller countries to become less reliant on, for example, the Maduro regime for their energy needs. And in that vein, partner with our Caribbean neighbors to develop alternative sources of energy so they too can reduce their reliance on the Maduro regime. The second aspect of helping with economic growth is to fight corruption by making common cause with a generation of new leaders that are battling corruption in countries like Guatemala and Argentina, the opposition leaders in Venezuela, the Brazilian civil society actors, by publicly speaking out about the cost of corruption, especially to the poor in the region, as well as to American exporters, by replicating the U.S.-Colombia Advisory Council on a regional level, bringing together business leaders and anti-corruption experts to discuss corporate governance, rule of law, and ethics, including countries like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Peru, nations that are open, active, and looking forward to being engaged in initiatives such as this, and by reinvigorating the International Anti-Corruption Agreement of the OAS and the OECD, and use financial tools to impose sanctions for individuals and national noncompliance. The third, which is the one I spent a significant amount of time on, is defending our values. And for me, that begins by standing up to dictators and standing up for freedom and for democracy. I fear, quite frankly, for the better part of 30 or 40 years, too much time has been used to placate hostile governments. During the Cold War, we looked the other way as right-wing dictators took power and abused on their people in the hopes of keeping out the Soviet Union. In the 21st century, we've too often looked the other way or outright neglected, as democracy and the rule of law have been canceled in places like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like Ecuador, like Bolivia, and sadly, for almost 7 decades, Cuba. Presidential messaging and leadership is critical and needed to reverse the perception in the region that the United States is tougher on its allies than it is on its adversaries. And that's why I hope that we will, in a strategic way, recalculate the concessions that have been made to a dictatorship in Cuba, and that we will also finally begin to pressure the Maduro government in Venezuela to follow its own laws, to hold an election, to work constructively to tackle these regional challenges. In that vein, it is critical that from this building, from Congress, and throughout government, we place democracy and human rights at the core of United States foreign policy in this region and throughout the world to ensure that our assistance programs reflect this. But I believe we need to robustly engage at the Organization of American States to rescue the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was neglected for far too long by presidents in both parties, and make clear to our partners that they will also be expected to speak out, as many now are doing, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Peru, in Chile. Speak out when their neighbors are violating the rights of their own citizens. It's critical in this vein as well to reassure our allies. For far too long, I believe we've neglected many of our traditional partners in the region. We need to build on the deep ties we have with countries like Canada and Mexico, Colombia, and grasp the new opportunities that have presented themselves in Peru, in Brazil, in Argentina, just to name a few. In particular, I believe Canada can play a key role in helping to promote security, prosperity, and democracy in the region. And partners like Colombia and Mexico have great potential to expand their engagement within and outside of the hemisphere. That's why, again, I go back to it, but I think we need to empower the Organization of American States to fulfill its mission, as stipulated in Article 1 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I believe we need to develop new policy planning to discuss regional as well as global challenges. We need to engage more frequently with regional partners and international fora on issues unrelated to the Western Hemisphere. By establishing new military-to-military engagements with Brazil by the FARC do not go unpunished, and the victims are adequately compensated. And finally, by reassessing U.S. assistance program in the region and assured that our aid efforts are actually having the desired impact in places like Haiti, and that factors such as corruption are not undermining the effectiveness of our support. We must make clear that despite these fiscal constraints that we face here in Washington, D.C., the United States is willing to continue to support those partners, and that commit to dealing with security challenges, that respect democratic norms and the rule of law, and that the United States and support these broader issues in the international fora. It's a lot to digest. I know it reads almost like a PowerPoint. It almost became one. But I wanted to get that on the record because, as I said earlier, so much of the things that we want to do are guided by tactics. And the one point I try to make to my colleagues is that more often than not, I said this last night about Colombia at a great gathering that we were able to have at the ambassador's residence, that more often than not in the Western Hemisphere, our allies in the region are an answer, not a problem. That more often than not, we are more linked than we believe. Now, obviously the media doesn't cover the Western Hemisphere as much as it once did. Much of the global attention is paid to North Korea or what's happening in Syria, and rightfully so. These are issues of incredible global importance. But I think the extraordinary opportunities that exist in this hemisphere for a 21st century of shared prosperity are extraordinary. And perhaps it's because I live in Miami that I've seen it firsthand. I remember vividly. My wife is of Colombian descent, and so I remember vividly the 1990s, where not only was traveling to Colombia to visit relatives out of the question, but in fact there was always the fear that someone you loved could be next, losing their lives in a bombing, not because of political engagement, because they happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And through much effort, blood, sacrifice, and with American assistance, the people of Colombia went from being on the verge of a failed state to perhaps our strongest regional partner in South America today, and one of the most capable, perhaps, in the world. All of that is the result of U.S. engagement, not U.S. disengagement. And again, the bulk of that responsibility fell on the Colombian people and its leaders, and they lived up to that responsibility. But we helped, and it wasn't charity. It helped us too. And you see it every single day in South Florida. And the planes and containers that arrive full of flesh flowers that are then shipped through logistics run by Americans or Colombian Americans or Americans in general from our airports and seaports, creating extraordinary economic opportunity. You see it in the tourists that fly into Orlando from Argentina and Brazil and Venezuela and Colombia, I apologize. But you also see it in the decline in visitors and prosperity in places like Venezuela, one of the richest resource countries on the planet, where the average Venezuelan, according to a recent report, lost 19 pounds in the last year. And it wasn't a result of exercise or diet. It's a result of economic calamity and disaster. And so you see right there in two bordering countries the distress of bad governance, bad policy, and the opportunities of good leadership and economic engagement. This is what we hope for the region. This is important. It's in our benefit as a nation. And I can tell you if 40, 30, 20 years from now, we live in a hemisphere where we have more countries, like Mexico with a growing middle class, like Colombia with, despite its challenges, growing security and trade opportunities, like Brazil, which has now gone through its constitutional process and hopefully will be able to move forward, like Argentina, which is embracing the free market and the opportunities it brings with it. Would life in America be more prosperous and safer, or less prosperous and less? The great thing about it is, because we haven't been debating it for far too long, as of now, anyways, there are no partisan lines. There are no pre-existing positions. It's an open and blank slate in many ways, and it allows us to write it in a way that benefits America and Americans, meaning the broader region. And I thank you for the importance you've always given it and continue to give it in highlighting this. And my hope is that in the years to come, as we come back and engage with you, that many of the ideas that you're producing and that we've offered are becoming reality, and the fruits are out there for all to see. So again, I thank you for this extraordinary opportunity to address you. And I look forward to continuing to hear from you, learn from you, work with you, and achieve prosperity together with you and with our partners in the region. Thank you very much. I'm on the third. Yes.
So, Senator, thank you for that compelling and thoughtful vision of U.S. engagement and collaboration in the hemisphere. Now we have a few minutes for Q&A. People will be circulating with mics, so just please raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, Alejandro, the mic will be coming.
Thank you for your time and for letting us be here with you. You mentioned in your first part of your speech the relevance, and I couldn't agree with you more, of what corruption does with countries. I'm from Mexico, and it's definitely one of our biggest challenges. One of the things that's feeding corruption, as you very well know, is narcotráfico. I'm sure you know about supply and demand. So you didn't mention anything about the fact that in the U.S. is really where the drug is consumed. The guns that are killing Mexicans come from the U.S., and the money is also coming from the U.S. through the border. Do you have any reflection on that, and what can you do for it?
No, it's a very valid point. And I don't talk about it in the speech because I kind of limited it to and you're right, maybe we should re-examine that as part of our Western Hemisphere strategy. You know, the first has always been true. Sadly, America has been the market of choice for consumption for cocaine, obviously marijuana, cocaine, and now opiates and heroin, and that remains the case. And the other reality that we're now facing is that as many of these nations have become more prosperous, consumption has increased internally as well, so it's become a joint a problem in that regard. And to that, I would say a couple points. We now are facing this opiate crisis in the United States, and it is part of our, in fact, just today, as part of my appropriations role, is continue to seek full funding for programs, not just to prevent addiction to opiates, which often begin through the prescription medical route, but also to help treat people as a medical condition. The fact of the matter is, and the medical research on it is as clear as can possibly be, if you are addicted to an opiate, your ability to break free from it, absent military intervention, listen to me, absent medical intervention, yeah, airstrikes against opium, is almost none. And the problem is, for most people, those resources don't exist. So we've tried to work it from the ground up in Florida, because ultimately where these problems are manifesting themselves is at the local level. People become addicted, they wind up in the emergency room, they save your life with Narcan, and then you're back out on the street, and they're seeing some of the same people 6-7 times a week, multiple times a day, who are overdosing now on street heroin. So addressing that, absolutely, we've got to cut off the demand part of it. And the supply part of it is important because of the things that it breeds. The problem is that as soon as you cut off one substance, it migrates to another. So this will be an ongoing challenge for us moving forward. But you're fair to point out that I neglected to mention that is a big part of this endeavor, and that is the demand side. And I would venture to guess that in the years to come, sadly, in some ways, as nations become more prosperous, they will too see an uptick in consumption in the hemisphere, and so we may need to be working with them hand in hand on developing best practices in that regard as well. But you're absolutely right to point that out. Where's the microphone?
Microphone's there. I'll go ahead and ask a question.
Okay, good. Just so comprehensive, I know.
I guess my question is, what we're seeing in Venezuela is a humanitarian disaster. And, you know, the unfolding of this is uncertain. But really, what is the sort of planning for a total sort of collapse in this humanitarian disaster that's going to take resources from the region?
Well, that's a great point. And first of all, I spent a lot of time, I don't mean this in a condescending way, a lot of time explaining to my colleagues the nature of the issue in Venezuela, because the traditional issue in many countries is you've got a government in power, you've got a civil society against them, and they're in this loggerheads. The issue in Venezuela is a little different. You actually have a National Assembly elected by the people of Colombia despite rampant fraud against them, who have basically been canceled. So the way I explain it to them is, imagine if the president tomorrow called down and said, I'm cutting off your funding, I don't care what laws you pass, we're not going to put them into place, we're not going to pay you any salaries, you don't even have money for ink, pens, paper, anything, and we're just going to ignore the National Assembly and any laws that you pass. That's the state of affairs. And then imagine if they said, and by the way, we're kicking out every independent news outlet, and the one that remained, I'm going to get my good friend to buy it, so they can report my side of it. And then imagine if on top of that you invited a foreign power, in this case Cuba, to come in and take over your intelligence gathering, your passport operation and the like, because you don't in some ways, trust your own people to do it because you don't think they'll oppress their own people if push comes to shove. That's the situation we now face. So the demands of the opposition in Venezuela, we say the opposition, they're the majority in the National Assembly, is very simple. Under the Constitution put in place under Hugo Chavez, they're supposed to have elections this year, hold the elections. Under the Constitution, if you gather a significant number of signatures, there has to be a presidential recall. They ignored it. Under the Constitution, there's supposed to be elections a year from now for the presidency. Hold that election. In essence, follow your own laws. That's their ask. And that's being ignored. And so I've been very pleased to see nations in the region take leadership on this. I really have. I mean, it's been one of the most uplifting experiences to see Mexico, Argentina, Chile, others, just stand, Peru, Colombia, stand firmly, and a growing number of nations joining that, and in Central America as well. You talk about the humanitarian crisis. That already exists. So last week I filed a bipartisan bill to create a fund and authorize a fund that would be available of assistance to help the transition in Venezuela, given the disaster they now face. And what that means is there's two reasons for it. One is to help the people in Venezuela, because it's going to be very difficult to be successful after an election or any sort of transition. And by the way, ideally, that's what I want it to be. The change in Venezuela, I want it to be at the ballot box. I don't prefer it be any other way. It may end up being another way, but that's the way I prefer it. It would be better for Venezuela if it was at the ballot box. But even if that were to occur, the societal challenges they face are extraordinary. And if those aren't confronted, that new government is going to fail, creating even further problems. And so the creation and the authorization of this fund so that it is available to provide assistance as soon as we're allowed to provide it. I think it also has the impact of helping our allies in the region. The last thing Colombia needs is a migratory crisis at its own border. It already faces significant challenges internally in the implementation of a peace plan and all the other challenges faced by some of these cartels that have emerged in areas where the FARC has decided to pull out. The last thing Brazil needs is a challenge. The last thing Guyana needs is a challenge of migratory pressure. And so that's also of assistance to them. So we have authored that bill. It's now in place, and we want to authorize the money so that then obviously we have to go out and make sure that it's in place and prepared to provide the aid if necessary. But I think this is an important moment for the region. Voice is important, and we should lead. And I've been pleasantly surprised that despite whatever people's political views, I know there are different views in this room about the current administration, I will say this to you. I was able to take Lilian Tintori to visit the president, who was the wife of Leopoldo Lopez, and I have received multiple reports from leaders in the region that when they meet with the president, he always asks about Venezuela. Now, I don't know if that meeting is what had that impact or something else did, but that's good news. The open-mindedness that exists in the administration beyond the White House, into the State Department and the National Security Council and the other divisions to do something with regards to this and give it the regional importance it deserves is promising. We have to follow through on it. And that's what I'm working on. But it's important. America's voice is important. But I think the most promising development I've seen is the nations in the region, the democracies in the region willing to stand up and condemn it. And I think that's had even a greater impact than in many cases some of the things that we have done. And I hope that that will continue. One of the best ways to create stronger ties with our allies in the region is to start doing things together, is to start to engaging together in products and in projects of joint interest. And I think democracy in Venezuela should be one of them. And so in many ways, I think it's been a promising exercise in that regard as well.